The role of antibody drug conjugates has really expanded tremendously, actually, this year in 2020, because we have two new drugs approved. Before this time, we really had one antibody drug conjugate, trastuzumab emtansine, or colloquially known as TDM1, to treat patients with HER2-positive breast cancer, until also reasonably uh, recently, we've had ADCs primarily to be in clinical trials or in clinical use for TDM1 in the metastatic setting. But in the last year and a half, we've seen the antibody drug conjugate TDM1 or trastuzumab emtansine move into the adjuvant setting in patients with high risk. And then there's also been a number of different studies evaluating TDM1 in different combinations in the neoadjuvant and adjuvant setting for HER2-positive breast cancer. But actually, there is, I think, in the last year, the first regulatory approval of an antibody drug conjugate in high risk early stage disease. Otherwise, the ADCs really have been a treatment for metastatic disease, but of course, now they've taken more center stage because we have three antibody drug conjugates in clinical practice. The stage of disease for patients using ADCs is really defined by the clinical trials and regulatory path. Until quite recently, ADCs were used for metastatic breast cancer, with trastuzumab emtansine being the drug that was approved for the use of for the treatment of HER2-positive breast cancer. In the last year, we've seen, last 2 years, we've seen trastuzumab emtansine take a center role in the adjuvant setting in patients with high-risk disease after neoadjuvant therapy. And then there's an additional clinical trial that isn't a regulatory pathway that looked at TDM1 in patients who had early stage small node-negative HER2-positive breast cancers. And so that was another area where TDM1 was effective. For the newer ADCs, they of course were approved in patients who've had pre-treated metastatic breast cancer, so not in the first line setting. But given the success and the positive data that we've seen, I expect that we will see movement of these drugs into the early stage setting in the next few years as the ongoing and planned trials are reported. I think the understanding of my colleagues in terms of risk of interstitial lung disease depends a lot on the setting. In the academic setting or groups that are participating in many clinical trials, they will have seen agents that cause ILD. Certainly, this has been true in other malignancies as well. So they will be aware of the risk with specific agents. But in most cases, ILD is quite uncommon, and particularly severe ILD is quite uncommon. So I think that many practitioners who are in clinical practice, who don't do a lot of clinical trials, maybe just registration-based trials, maybe not as aware of ILD. And also, I think we all feel somewhat challenged in our ability to diagnose and pinpoint ILD versus the changes that are seen on chest CT or chest X-ray. We have certainly seen this, and I think the best example is screening for COVID-19 is that for many of my patients, there are some bits of interstitial changes in the lung. And it can be very hard to pinpoint whether that's related to treatment, a mild infection, asthma, or potentially another infection that could be more serious in the case of COVID-19. So I think that most practitioners understand there's a risk when the risk has been highlighted. They may not understand the risk for all agents. And I think we really first learned this in the breast cancer community with everolimus. And that has helped people be a little bit more aware of it, but it is still unclear about how quickly it is identified in the asymptomatic patient and how important it is to identify early ILD. I think that in terms of my experience with the development of drug-induced ILD or pneumonitis, since we use both terms interchangeably, the key thing is to have to really think about when you're seeing a patient and you're looking at a scan, for example, what is the drug that the patient is on, and could this be associated with drug-induced ILD? I think that's really the key step in this whole pathway is the suspicion. And that has been our experience as well. When we started using everolimus in the first neoadjuvant trial in breast cancer, I had a patient who developed drug-induced pneumonitis from everolimus. and it took us a little while to figure it out. Thankfully, the changes progressed very slowly when she progressed with a cough, and then she said she was a little short of breath. And, eventually we figured out the drug-induced ILD, which responded beautifully to steroids. And she ended up being cured of her disease, which was wonderful as well, and didn't have further complications. But it really was a good lesson in the clinical practice about how important it is to keep your suspicion up if somebody develops a symptom that's a little peculiar. And I will say that we have the experience, I think, of COVID-19, where people had bizarre experiences with drug-induced ILD, and then now with immunotherapy, where I think we do always have to be on guard and take comments and symptoms that patients report that may seem out of the sort of cancer realm seriously.